Good morning, everybody. You're joined here by Claire Stead at Smoothwall and my colleague Michael Miller. While we just wait for some other people to join, I wonder if those of you who are already dialed in could just give us a comment and let us know that you can hear us okay. Thank you for those of you who've just confirmed that there. So without further ado, we'll get started on today's webinar, addressing the challenges of cybersecurity within education. Just wait for my slide to change over. There we go. So as I just mentioned, my name's Claire Stead. I'm the head of marketing here at Smoothwall, and I'm just really here to introduce the webinar. We've got my colleague Michael Miller who'll be taking the lead today, and Michael looks after all of our education divisions, so he really is the expert when it comes to that sector and is going to talk you through the cybersecurity challenges in that space. The reason we've put on this webinar this month and another series of webinars that we've already been doing is it's National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and what this really does is it brings to light the importance of cybersecurity, not just in the workplace, but in organisations such as schools and other public sector corporations. And we really just want to take the time to put some focus and emphasis on cybersecurity and use this month as an opportunity to raise awareness with people of the challenges that we all face when it comes to cybersecurity. And I really hope that you are able to take something away from this today. There's certainly a lot more useful information on the National Cybersecurity Organisation's website. You can follow the link that's on the screen now. And certainly if you keep up to date with what Smoothwall's doing, you'll see that we've shared out several useful links and blogs over the month about how you can be more cyber aware and really have a focus in your workplace on instilling a strong cybersecurity culture. So today's is obviously going to take more of a focus on the education space. So I'll hand over to you, Mike, and you can really talk about cybersecurity within education at the moment.
Thank you for that, Claire. As Claire said, I'm Michael Miller. I'm head of our education side of things at Smoothwall. And just before I get going, there's just a couple of stats on the screen for you. So 50%, that represents the total statistics in terms of cybersecurity crimes, and it accounts for half of all the crimes that were committed last year. And it was at a cost to the UK economy of about £30 billion, which is absolutely astronomical. However, one of the things that tends to happen is there's a belief that this only really affects either individuals at home or big business. There's this maybe naivety in general. I'm not saying everybody on the line is guilty of this, but across the education space, there is a real different mindset that we often see. And a good example of that is the fact that when we go out to our corporate market, we position ourselves as a web security specialist, whereas when we're talking to our education clientele, even though the product underlying everything that we're doing is almost exactly the same, we're talking about safeguarding and web filtering. We're not talking necessarily so much about security, and really we maybe need to look at a change in that kind of dialogue. So as you can see, everyone's at risk these days. It isn't a case of just big business, as I said, or individuals at home and things like that. There is a real risk. You know, the WannaCry that everyone will have seen through the public sector that hit a lot of healthcare organizations, you know, that was public sector focused. And again, there was this maybe naivety across the public sector in general that there isn't so much of a risk there and you can get away with a bit more and not be so security minded. So why education? What do we need to think about in education? So first of all, within an educational environment, you are managing quite a lot of sensitive and personal data. And as probably most of you will know, that tends to be the way in for a lot of these attacks. Most businesses, most organizations, most public sector organizations have quite good security tools in general, in terms of antivirus, anti-phishing, anti-malware, etc. However, if there is a breach, that's what they're going to be going after, and there's obviously still very useful information in terms of if you were trying to do a cybersecurity attack on an individual that is stored by a school. One of the other big problems is you've got a lot of young people that you're protecting, and some of those people, if not most, will probably be quite unaware of the risks of cybersecurity and what challenges and what vulnerabilities there are out there in terms of the way that they might be approaching the web in general. They've got very limited security knowledge, and they certainly don't have a lot of expertise. Now, we do have some schools that we're speaking to that do quite a lot of work around cybersecurity, a lot of education and things like that, but I'll come on to that kind of thing in a moment. As I was saying, when we're talking to the corporate space, the message is very different. We're talking about cybersecurity when we're positioning our product, and we're not doing that so much at the education level. Cybersecurity strategy is quite clearly not at the forefront, and I know that with budgets being tightened across the education space as a whole, with new legislation coming out where you're required to do things like safeguarding, which was never on the agenda before, when you're now starting to have to look at things like GDPR, it's quite difficult for an educational organization to necessarily have cybersecurity at the forefront just because of all these other different things that are pulling at you. You've also got the side of things that naturally education, students, they're quite curious. So they're not only are they more at risk because they are maybe less educated about the risks of cybersecurity, but not only that, they're also a lot more curious than the rest of us. You know, I tend to have fairly static browsing behavior. I go to my banking websites, I go to, you know, my BBC News and things like that generally, whereas there's a huge amount of curiosity out there from students, and as a result, not only are they the most at risk because they're less aware, but they're also probably going to find themselves in harm's way more often than maybe the rest of us, just because of that curious element that they have within education. So as a result of that, you know, there is a real big target on you guys and the education space as a whole. And there's another element of that, which is the reason why, you know, big business might have been targeted in the past was because it's quite costly doing a cybersecurity attack. There's a lot of investment made by the people who are doing it, and they're making that investment because they want a return on that investment. With the way that the web has evolved, with the way that technologies have evolved in things like Amazon cloud services, the malware that's available at everybody's fingertips, you know, Stuxnet, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Stuxnet in terms of that malware. It was taking advantage of multiple zero-day anomalies, and that code, that malicious code, was made available just as an open source type thing on the web anywhere so that anyone could take advantage of it and use it. So things are so much more accessible now from a malware perspective, and as a result, it's made the landscape in terms of who's at risk vastly, vastly bigger. So that's one of the reasons why we really wanted to address it today. So in terms of consequences, you know, some of these are obvious, and again, I'm trying not to be too obvious, but I think it is really important to reaffirm some of these problems. First of all, the misuse of personal information, that could affect individuals within the school. So it might not necessarily impact the school at a top level, but you know, you've got a duty of care to students under your care, and you know, if their data gets out there, there's a huge risk. I've seen just today in the BBC where there was information about an individual at a school whose personal information was being shared around. Now, that might not have come from the school's network, but we all know the damage that can be caused when that information gets leaked out and when it's being used in an inappropriate way. There's also the cost side of things. As we all know, the WannaCry ransomware attack that largely hit the healthcare side of things within the UK, that cost a lot of money, and whilst it hasn't been made completely public how much it did cost the taxpayer, there was a huge cost to a lot of organizations as a result of that. And ultimately, if you were subject to a ransomware attack, there's obviously another one in the papers right now which has affected a large part of Eastern Europe. If you were to be affected, then there will undoubtedly be a cost, and that might be in terms of actual money, but there's also other costs such as downtime or reputational damage. You know, every single thing these days seems to make its way into the papers, whether that's locally or not. And if you're a school and maybe you've got a high-profile set of users, or you're trying to build some type of reputation, anything like this will inevitably have a damaging consequence on the school as a whole. So in terms of the attack vector, it tends to be people. And a big piece of this, of course, is making sure you have something like Smoothwall and other anti-malware type and security type products that you have at your gateway. However, ultimately, one of the kind of most cost-effective ways of reducing the risk to any organization is actually an investment in time of educating people about what risks are out there, how to behave appropriately online. And I know we're getting a lot of support and a lot of contact from schools that are wanting to do this, looking for advice from businesses like us, but also taking advice from a lot of free information that's out there in the wider world, and using that to educate students, staff, because that is ultimately the most appropriate place to look. You know, I've got a close and dear friend of mine who spends a lot of time looking at security articles and things like that, and it probably would shock a lot of people, but he doesn't have anti-malware on his computer because his methodology and his kind of ideology is all around the fact that it's all about your behavior. If you behave in the right way on the web, you're actually very rarely at risk. And it's actually about the way that you behave, the types of things that you open. You know, everyone I imagine who's on this call knows that you don't open a link on an email from somebody that you don't know. It's just good practice. But we're constantly having to deal with new people who are quite young and have a lot less experience of dealing with these types of things. And it's about this constantly evolving education piece. The other side of things is actually teaching within schools. So, you know, social media, whilst I believe there's an age limit on things like Facebook and things like that, we all know that you can set whatever age you want and immediately set up a Facebook profile. There's no actual checks to make sure that you are of the right age. So people are inevitably going to find their way onto there before that we maybe want them to. So we need to take the front foot and we need to start educating as much as we can. And I think the schools can lead the way there, which will ultimately make the school as a whole a safer environment for everyone to operate in. Yeah, education as early as possible is key. So I've gone on about this a lot, but just to reiterate, children are more curious, they're more vulnerable, they're less cybersecurity aware, and therefore ultimately one of the highest risks as a vector for attack within any organization. So in terms of where Smoothwall can help, some of you will undoubtedly be using one or more or all of our product sets, but just so you can give you a bit of a breakdown on the tools that are kind of available to you. The SWG, which is our standalone web filtering service, there's a lot of web security elements to that product outside of just blocking of websites. So as part of our filtering, one of the things that we do is we do look for things like phishing websites and other malicious websites, and those are all in categories which can be blocked. So there's a security category, and if you block that, then it will stop people getting access to known vulnerable or infected or malicious websites like phishing sites and things like that. So that's step one. Something that's a little less widely known, especially within the education space, but is a big feature that we push in our corporate customers when we're talking about web security, is the web filter has content modification tools. So what we can actually do is when we go on a website that has, when somebody browses for a website that has parts of the code of that website, because of our real-time filtering, we look at the construction of a web page, and where we can see that a web page might be vulnerable or might be infected, we can actually use content modification to either strip out code within that website that's at risk, or if there is too much damage or too much risk on that website and we can't actually content modify that page so that it is a safe website, we'll actually just block that website. So even if we've never seen a web page before, we can still do a huge amount around the security of that web page, which you'll be relieved to know. A lot of our education customers take our full UTM solution, so that's firewall and web filter. And again, we have a next generation firewall. So we're doing application aware filtering, we're doing IPS and IDS to make sure that we're trying to prevent intrusion into your network, and then also combining all the best of breed filtering technology and methodology that we use across the web filter, all rolled into one UTM proposition. So rest assured, you are protected, and it offers a layer of security, and that's one of the other things that we talk about a lot when we're talking to customers that are focused on security. Smoothwall can offer layers. We can offer a lot of protection. And then you also see Visigo up there. So those of you who are familiar with our Visigo product, you'll know that that's our monitoring software. And you might wonder whether monitoring actually fits into a web security strategy, but it really does. And where it does fit into that is when we're monitoring, we're looking at obviously key things against the prevent agenda, such as bullying and grooming and things like that. We're looking at those types of things. But ultimately, if we're talking about a vulnerable student, then that vulnerable student is also a vulnerable student in terms of the way that they behave and how likely they are to be at risk of some type of cybersecurity attack as well. So ultimately, all of these tools that Smoothwall offers, whilst we heavily focus in terms of a lot of the wording and things like that we push out into the education space is around prevent and protection and things like that. We're also in there, we're talking about security, we just have it as a less strong message. So rest assured, we offer a large proportion of kind of the layers that you'd be looking for from a security element for your network. In terms of Smoothwall, we have an online safety zone. So again, getting back to the people, the students that are in there, there's a lot of resources that we try and make available completely free of charge. There's white papers on there about ways that you can do certain things. There's also information specifically aimed at children. There's information specifically aimed at you as an organization. All this is free of charge. We constantly look at improving and evolving this. We're also in contact with market specialists and industry-leading experts in terms of things like security, prevent. We also have links into the DFE and other organizations in order to be a full, we are safeguarding business as a whole. That is the total thing. And whilst we make our money from selling our products into organizations, the wider piece is about trying to do everything we can. And we know that people is a big piece of that puzzle. So the tools are there for you. If you want to have a further conversation beyond this, obviously there'll be a chance for people to ask questions towards the end, which we're very, very near. But also, if you want to get in contact with us, or you're concerned that maybe there's features that you could have from Smoothwall that you currently you aren't using, or you aren't licensed for, then please do get in contact with us. We'd be very happy to speak to you about it. And that doesn't just go for the next days and months. Anytime that it's appropriate, please do get in contact with us. We'd be very happy to speak to you about it and point you in the right direction, or provide you with information about what products might be useful in order to deal with security.
Thanks for that, Michael. That was really interesting. What we'd really like to do is open up to questions from the audience. So if anybody on the line wants to use the question chat feature, please do use that so that we can get your questions answered. In the meantime, I'd just be really keen to ask Michael, you mentioned about the conversation in education was typically around safeguarding, and it now needs to move around cybersecurity. But would you not say that actually those two are merging into the same thing anyway? Because when we talk about personal data, there's such sensitive data schools hold on vulnerable people, with them being children, that actually as part of their safeguarding, cybersecurity really should be a huge part of that, because they've got that element that they have to protect a child, and that shouldn't just be them physically in person, but also a child's online identity. Absolutely, and I think what you said there hits the nail on the head. Ultimately, the two things are inherently interlinked completely. You can't have safeguarding without looking at cybersecurity. However, it's largely about the dialogue that's used in the education space. That's the main difference. As I said, underlying our products and underlying all of our messages are the same types of conversations that we have with corporate customers. It's just we use different terminology and we talk about different things. There's a huge piece around safeguarding,
and cybersecurity is just completely interlinked with that. And it's just about making sure that it is part of what you're thinking about, and it's not just enough to go, okay, well, we're looking at things like bullying, we're looking at things like grooming and things like that, and making sure that we're identifying that. It's about the security of that information, as you said, and various other bits and bobs as well. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
That's not a problem. We've got a question from Robin, who I assume is already using Smoothwall, who says he's assuming that content modification requires HTTPS man in the middle to be set up, and how would that work with BYOD?
Yeah, so great question. There are, well, the first consideration is whether or not the website that you're browsing to is secure. If it is secure, then you're absolutely right. You would need HTTPS man in the middle, decrypt and inspect enabled on your Smoothwall in order to perform content modification, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to view the content of the page. There's still quite a lot of web content out there that isn't secure. I guess on the flip side of that, one of the good things about a lot of secure websites is they tend to be less at risk from malware, and that's and you know, malicious attacks and things like that. I think that's probably initially why a lot of websites like Google have gone secure, is to try and have that message, although I think there's a lot more to it underneath the surface. But I think one of the overarching benefits of secure websites is generally they are more secure and less exposed to this kind of risk. But where there is a risk, you're right, you would need decrypt and inspect man in the middle. From a BYOD perspective, again, it's about, you can actually do full man in the middle decrypt and inspect on BYOD, but it is a slightly different configuration, and probably beyond my technical expertise in terms of getting it set up and giving you the how-to over the phone, and I'm sure that's not necessarily what you're looking for today, but I can assure you that it can be set up, and I would recommend that if you'd like to get in contact with us after this directly, or if you'd like me to just drop a quick, using the question thing, just say, please do contact me, and I will, and we'll reach out to you after this webinar and arrange for a call with one of our solutions architects, and they can give you a bit more advice on how that can be set up and managed going forwards.
That's great, thanks, Mike. I'd just like to kind of round up. You mentioned there about different types of sites suffering differently from attacks. What do cyber criminals look for? You know, are they sat at home going, oh, I'm going to target this school because they look like they're in an affluent area, or is it completely out of the control? It's not an individual person with the hood up, sat behind the keyboard, as we see in all these photographs, and actually it's a lot more automated. You know, how does a school know whether they are likely to be attacked or not?
Well, that's absolutely what the evolution's been, and you've described it really well there. It used to be a case that a cybersecurity attack required a really, really focused attack on an individual organization or something like that. And what you'll often find is brute force attacks and things like that aren't that common. And when they do happen, they tend to be massive, like these ransomware attacks that are exploiting a specific vulnerability. But again, the reason why it hit so many organizations all at once is because the power of the internet now and the power of technology now is so vast that they're not sat there looking through a directory and going, oh, that's an interesting school, or that's an interesting organization to attack. What they're looking at is, right, I found a vulnerability here, and I've got the power to go and literally try every single doorway that is available to me across the web and see whether that I can deliver this piece of malware through. And that's essentially what a lot of these ransomware attacks do these days. So I would say that the key thing is making sure that you're using an up-to-date anti-malware side of things. The key is also making sure that you're updating your network regularly and keeping up to date with the latest updates, because a majority of updates that comes out from Windows and any other thing these days is around security updates. You know, there's plenty of releases that come out from even Smoothwall that are not feature releases, they're security patches and vulnerabilities that we're patching up and making sure your network is safe. On the other side of it is education, because ultimately it really is impossible to sit there now and go, oh, I'm quite likely to be attacked for these reasons. The point is, we are all at risk, and it's just the nature of how the web has evolved over the last 5 or so years.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and certainly the key takeaway I would take away from that, I'm sure that the audience will, is that although education might not have once been a target when it was an individual looking for who to go after, as that's no longer the case, if their cybersecurity systems aren't up to date, then they absolutely are a target. It doesn't matter if you're a school, healthcare, company, whatever you may be, if you've got a vulnerability, that makes you a target. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of people going away and having a look that all their systems are up to date. And certainly, you know, if there is anything we can do to help, then please do contact us. Thank you, Michael, for all the information you shared today. It's been really useful. I hope the audience have found it useful as well. Please do get in touch with us afterwards if there's anything further that you'd like to talk about. And we really appreciate your time today. So thank you very much.